Welcome to the Startup Competitors Podcast, where we talk with early-stage entrepreneurs to understand what information they use to inform product roadmap, strategy, and market differentiation.
Hey there. As part of our three-part series supporting the book launch for the Titanic Effect, we're giving away 25 signed copies of the book. If you'd like a copy, leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform, and then tag us on any social media account with a photo of your review. The first 25 responses will get a signed copy mailed to them. Thanks, and enjoy this week's podcast with the authors of the Titanic Effect.
Welcome to the Startup Competitors Podcast. Today we're doing something different that we've never done before. We are going to be doing a three-part series this week and the next following 2 weeks on the Titanic Effect, which is a new book that is hopefully, by the time this goes out and available. You can find it in all the finer retailers, including Amazon. And it's a book that's written by Todd Saxton, Kim Saxton, Michael Cloran, and it's about startups and the journey that many startups go through and some of the icebergs that they can hit along the way. So today we have Todd Saxton on the podcast. Todd, welcome.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here, Michael.
And I figured we would start with you to maybe start with like a general overview of the book and maybe why you guys thought the Titanic Effect needed to exist.
Sure. Well, again, thanks for the opportunity. And I guess through our years, decades now, I almost hate to say that, of experience working with startups, teaching startups. I'm a professor at the Kelley School and have done a lot of mentoring of students and alums, but also do a lot with the venture community, including with Developer Town, and get to encounter a lot of entrepreneurs and their startup ideas. And over the years, Kim and I have started to notice patterns in terms of these, what we are now calling debtbergs or icebergs that startups run into that end up either limiting their potential down the road or in some cases even sinking them. So when you start to see these patterns, you start to want to start calling out warnings, right? Be careful, you're about to hit an iceberg. Around the same time that we were seeing these patterns and piecing this together, we had the opportunity to be at joint functions with Michael Cloran, our third author, who was talking about technical debt and how Developer Town could help early stage companies avoid technical debt. Many of you are probably familiar with that. Maybe I'll even let you give the technical explanation. But basically, when you're a startup, you have lean resources. You may have to bootstrap or cut some corners to build your initial software or really product of any type. But then as you start to scale the organization, start to get more customers, it's kind of like a house of cards, right? You don't have a robust infrastructure to build on whatever that product or service might be. But those patterns don't just exist in the technology or the product domain. They also exist in the people that you affiliate with early on in your startup. So that may be your co-founders, it may be the advisors or investors you bring on. And if you get to the point, which is great, that you're actually hiring people who are your first employees, and again, start to see some patterns across the set of relationships that founders were engaging in, how they were doing things like allocating equity across the founding team that tended to systematically result in problems down the road. On the marketing side, I'm sure you'll hear more from my co-author and partner, Kim, but this was around the time that the lean startup was also really getting traction. And entrepreneurs became very enamored with the term we all know and love, pivot, right? Everybody loves to pivot. Well, you have to realize that every time you pivot, that you start to send one signal or message to your market, one value proposition. Every time you move away from that, you actually have to create a new perception in the minds of your customers, in the minds of your market, and even in the minds of your investors in some cases, and re-educate as to who you are and what you're really trying to, what problem you're trying to solve and who you're trying to solve that for. So again, seeing these patterns across startups of not just technical debt, but a broader construct that we are calling in the book hidden debts, and then how to kind of categorize them, to recognize them, and then hopefully navigate around them so the venture is less likely to fail.
Got it. And the two big areas that you focused on, I think, I guess I should do this in form of a question, but I think the two areas that you focused on were the human and the human and strategy pieces of that, correct?
Yes. So I am a management and entrepreneurship professor. That's kind of my training, early consulting work. And then my doctoral training was in the management discipline. Kim's is in marketing. And obviously Michael is an expert in the technology kind of piece. So kind of covered the oceans, as we call them, extending the Titanic metaphor and in our areas of expertise.
Random question. Did you learn more than you ever wanted to know about the Titanic in the undertaking of this book?
Learned a lot more. I wouldn't say more than we ever wanted to know. It was actually really interesting. So I'll kind of tee up a little bit the initial naming, right? So this is one of those fun like origin stories. We're sitting around the table, a table right here in Developer Town, kind of talking through our first presentation together where we wanted to kind of unveil these concepts. And Michael already had his gig very well nailed down on technical debt. Right. We were trying to, kind of feel out whether these other domains of debt kind of resonated with him, which they did. We had the opportunity to present at the Innovation Showcase, which was held right here in Developer Town in 2015. So we were kind of mapping out the presentation, talking about hidden debts. And I'm kind of both a visual guy, but also the naming guy. Which means I don't get any deeper than naming it. And then it's like, it's up to you to make this work. But I've got a good name. So came up with the name, extending kind of hidden debt. A lot of it's beneath the surface. So it's like an iceberg. And who doesn't think about icebergs without thinking about the Titanic, right? So to me, it just jumped right in my head, the Titanic Effect. What a interesting metaphor for what ventures run into. Now, in this case, not because it's too big to fail, but because you're running into something where most of the substance is non-visible or below the surface. Well, my co-authors felt that we should probably do some research to see if there was any substance to that as a name for kind of the presentation, which was actually ended up being a great idea. And as it turns out, there are a number of parallels across all of these oceans or categories of hidden debt that the White Star Line, which built and operated the Titanic, and the ship, the Titanic itself, incurred. And with your permission, I'll give just a few little examples.
Yeah, absolutely.
So White Star Line was in financial trouble, brought in a new investor, Christian Schwab, if I recall, and who made them change shipyards to his nephew's shipyard, surprisingly. You bring on a new investor and you think, great, we've got, we can stay afloat, we've got this source of money, but all of a sudden they're changing something pretty fundamental about the organization. Well, in the new strategy, which was brought on by a different investor, who JP Morgan, actually, if you know JP Morgan Chase, that is the original JP Morgan. He came on in the early 1900s, and it was getting increasingly expensive for White Star Line to maintain its differentiation, which was to be the fastest in the ocean.
Okay.
So they won the Blue Ribbon Prize, which was the fastest across the Atlantic from Ireland or England into port in New York, typically. They won that prize a number of times with earlier generations. But as the ships get bigger, it gets more and more expensive and difficult to maintain a speed advantage. So what they switched to was luxury and size. We're not going to be the fastest anymore. We're going to be the biggest and most luxurious. Well, they decided to build 3 ships at the same time, all the biggest. They ran out of rivets that were made of steel. And you think about the things that hold the boat together,
yep.
Right? You have these big steel sheets. You have these rivets holding them together. You run out of steel. You have to rely on slag, which is basically an inferior material that's a spinoff of the steel. Well, the slag rivets ended up being in those exterior bulkheads where the ship hit the iceberg. So you have this technical debt of trying to grow too fast using inferior raw material, coinciding with the change in strategy of ship moving to most luxurious instead of fastest. And then there were some design changes. If you're going to market something luxurious, you don't want to have just a 1-story dining room, right? You want to have a 2-story fabulous dining room, which shrinks the height of your bulkheads. So when it hits an iceberg and the rivets tear, you've got water pooling into bulkheads that have a lower barrier between each one. So the water spills over faster and the ship sinks way faster than anyone expected. So you have this kind of interaction of changes in strategy, changes in marketing and how you approach the market. And all of these manifestations of hidden debts ended up playing very nicely into our narrative of hidden debts, how they can sink startups and create this kind of aggregation of factors, as opposed to just the unstoppable force meeting the immovable object.
That's awesome. I didn't even know all that stuff. That's really cool. Okay, so let's jump into an ocean. Which would you prefer to start with, human or strategy?
Let's start with strategy. I think it plays nicely into what I was just talking about with the White Star and Titanic. The strategy ocean, I'm a strategy prof first, kind of came into entrepreneurship second. And strategy is basically about how you manage interactions between those different oceans. So if you think about when you're trying to be strategic in building your business plan, it's not just about the product. It's not just about the people that are going to build and deliver that product. It's not just about who you're going to sell it to. It's not just about how you're going to fund it and what you're going to charge for it. It's how all of those relate to each other.
Yeah.
And we're talking about patterns. In my experience, technical founders, whether it's software or product engineers, tend to get way down the road with the product before they start thinking about the market, the customers, the people, and how to pay for it, right? They get kind of fascinated with the design and the build piece of things.
Sure.
By the time they go to take something to market and discover that that's not what customers want to buy, it's a little late, right? So you want to make sure that you're navigating the uncertainty across these different domains roughly parallel to each other, as opposed to having one dimension. Now, I mentioned kind of the product-oriented engineering type, but we see a large number of the sales-oriented marketing types who just want to get out and sell something, and they sell something to the market way in front of when they can actually build or deliver, or whether they even can be sure they can build or deliver it. So a very visible example might be Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes and kind of, selling this technology that they couldn't even build. Now, it's not that the theory was wrong, but the ability to implement it. You don't establish a $9 billion cap on a dream and a promise that has no substance behind it. So anyway, kind of helping entrepreneurs understand their natural inclinations, which might be to overstep or overinvest in one domain, one ocean, if you will, before understanding the uncertainties and navigating the uncertainties in other related domains. So that's the main area that we see in strategy, is an imbalance between and not appropriate timing or sequencing of how you move forward.
So if you had to just pop one or two within strategy, one or two hidden debts that you see the most often, maybe when I know you sit on a number of boards, or you have tons of people who come to you to talk strategy or fundraising, or you're pretty active in the venture community. As you're having those conversations, maybe hit me with a couple of the most common hidden debts that you encounter in the wild?
Sure. So two I mentioned, integration of strategy, so understanding the implications across, and then an imbalance, right? Those are two icebergs that we identify in the Titanic Effect. But I'll give you a very specific example of where, and it's amazing how many entrepreneurs don't connect the dots very effectively on this. So they develop a product, they understand the market, they get product market fit, they go out, they build their financial statements, and they start to go to market. And all of a sudden, they start to find some resistance. Does this actually work? How do we know it's going to work for us? So they say, you know what, we're going to have a strategy of a free pilot. And that pilot might be 1 month to 3 months. First of all, if you're going to do a free pilot, always make it an opt-out at the end of that period as opposed to an opt-in, meaning at the end of the pilot trial, they have to do something to exit that relationship and not pay, as opposed to at the end of that period. So it's kind of like your credit card renewal, right? If you have your credit card in there and it comes up for monthly, if you had to actually make a decision to go pay the bill, you might not. If it's automatically coming off your credit card, you're probably less likely to discontinue. Anyway, that aside, so we see these marketing plans where you look at the financial statements and then realize that they've adopted, let's just say a 90-day pilot to get your software into a B2B, SaaS kind of solution. Well, if you haven't kind of rippled through and integrated the fact in your financials that you're not going to start charging for 3 months, and then you probably have another 60 to 90 days before you have cash in the bank, you've got basically a 6-month lag between when dollars come in the door and your investment in build, your investment in sales and marketing and support that you have to cover through investment. It's amazing how many times entrepreneurs just kind of stumble into the free pilot. Sales and marketing love it. Oh, it's getting so much easier to sell. We're getting, our systems into all these pilots. And all of a sudden, their burn rate goes up. Their cash in the door hasn't increased at all. And they're running out of money. Their fume date ends up being a lot sooner. So that's that kind of integration across functions, that when you make sales and marketing choices, there has to be a ripple through to your financial statements. In this case, a significant delay when you get cash in the door.
The way you forecast it. It's interesting. I was smiling while you said that because we have in one of our companies, we have even a more complicated version. It's very, very much the same thing, but more complicated. We'd built a bunch of financial models early on that, basically showed, first we knew we would have a long sales cycle, right? So we forecasted a long sales cycle, and then we knew we would do a pilot period with clients, and we believe they would be paid pilots, but not talking big bucks, right? But we'd have a paid pilot engagement that would go for some period of time, and then, at the end of that, then the client would flip over and leverage us throughout their portfolios, B2B solution, leverage us throughout their portfolio, and then, then of course, then the money rains, right? And so,
knock on wood.
Exactly. So then, of course, when that strategy, right, and we built a pro forma for that, and we raised some money on that, and we did all these things, classic things. And then, of course, when reality hits and that plan hits the real world, we find out the sales cycle is twice as long as we planned. Pilots went twice as long as we planned. When the client eventually did flip over and take us live to their portfolio, it wasn't like overnight they would say, great, now we're going to leverage you in all 300 widgets. We're going to leverage you in 5 widgets. And then next month, maybe 20 more. And then next month, maybe 30 more. And then maybe next, so it was like this slow ramp over a 12-month period where then, sure, by the end of, what we had originally forecasted is like, I don't know, I'll make up some numbers, like 9 months, we would be at full contract value. Turns out it's like, no, it's 15, 16 months before you're at full contract value. And then just thinking through, and that's just, then you have all the ramifications of that on everything else financially and in the pro formas, and how do you account for that? And, like exactly what you're saying. And for me, who was one of the people trying to make the math work in the pro formas, it was like at every step along that way, it was you trying to wrap your head around like, well, wait, what does this mean from a cash position? What does that mean for everything else we're doing? And not trying to be frustrated that you're learning, right? Like this is the whole point. Like this is right. What this business is, right? You need to go out there, try it, learn, figure it out, and adapt. But then, really understanding like, okay, if this is real, like this is really the way it's going to work. What does that mean for everything else that we're doing?
Absolutely. But then kind of to the next level, you're learning from that, your ability to articulate what you've learned and then have that influence your projections is so important in communicating with investors subsequently down the road, right? Because especially by the time you get to VCs, they're wanting to know what lessons did you learn about all of those things and have you changed systematically your planning accordingly so that when you come to me to raise, you really have a pretty good understanding. So, in your next customer, obviously you're hoping the sales cycle is going to be shorter. You're hoping the pilot's going to be shorter, but you can't really count on that. So, right, as you start to build your knowledge and experience, you start to get a better understanding of, nope, the sales cycle is 12 to 18 months. Or, hey, we're getting better at this. We've got it down to 9 to 12 months, but it's never really going to get to 6 months. So again, that's part of the learning that hopefully as a founding team, you're building over time to be able to tell that compelling story to investors. And if you have a straight line growth chart where you're tripling every year, no bobbles, no leveling off, that's a pretty good indication that you don't really have a good understanding of what's really going to drive scalability.
Right. Go back to those first two that you mentioned where you're out of alignment across the oceans, right? Like the way you're thinking about technology doesn't match with the way you're thinking about sales and marketing, which doesn't match the way you're thinking about people and process. When you see that, and I see this all the time. When you're outside of it, it is always easier to identify it and diagnose it, right? Because you're not in the mix, and it's easy to have that detached third party view. What do you do? How do you coach somebody through seeing what you see and then helping them get on the right path to fix it? What does that look like?
So one of the big kind of factors that advisors, mentors, investors like ourselves, are very kind of sensitive to is what we call coachability. Not we call as if we invented the term, but
Right.
A lot of people use that term. And it's really interesting to me how diverse the reaction to that kind of feedback is, which ranges everything from, boy, you just don't get it, do you? To, I hadn't really noticed that or thought about that. Let me think about it some more. Let me do some research and get back to you. So I think the first part is just your kind of personal orientation and how you take feedback in terms of spotting those trends or issues. It's one, and this is something that I do as a professor, right, is we take people away from their own experience and show them a model of someone else that is similar. So sometimes I'll have an entrepreneur go identify a success or a failure story in adjacent space, maybe not a direct competitor, and say, go look at them and tell me what you've learned. Now, what they might not know is I already know why they failed. And they failed because you're making exactly the same mistakes. But if I just tell you that, you're going to be like, no. But if you go read about somebody else, it's like, hey, wait a second. They're kind of like us. And then they come back and say, hey, you know what? They failed because they were doing this. And I think that's what we're doing too. Like, really, you think? So there are ways to get these across without like hammering somebody with it. And part of it is being coachable on the founder's end or the entrepreneur's end. But part of it is learning how to coach them, right, in a way that they are going to respond to. I'm going to digress here for a minute, but bear with me because it's a great story. So Rick Carlisle, who is now the coach of Mavericks, as many of you might know. But Rick went to University of Virginia, who just won the NCAA tournament, by the way, when I was there as an undergrad, and he was in Spanish class with me. So I got to know him. I wouldn't say we're great friends, but we know each other and recognize each other on campus and things. So when he came out and was an assistant coach for the Pacers, I was able to bring him in to the classroom to talk to the students, mostly about how do you manage these kind of high ego people, right? And it was really interesting what he loved about coaching at that time. And obviously, he's moved into a more senior kind of leadership role as a head coach. But he just loved kind of trying to take apart what each athlete needed to be motivated. There's a basketball player who's well known, and I will not name him. But if you directly even spoke to him, he would get angry, like physically angry, visibly angry. But Coach Carlisle figured out over time, after trying a number of different experiments, that if he videotaped something and left just 2 or 3 little bullet point notes on the videotape, put them in the guy's mailbox, the next day the guy would come in and he'd do that. It's like when you're rebounding, you need to put your foot closer to the basket, or you need to widen your hips so that someone isn't rebounding over you. And just like, again, 1 or 2 little bullets. But this guy would watch the video. He would see, and really work on those 2 little things or 3 little things. So again, I think part of the secret, especially as you move beyond your co-founders, although actually in some cases your co-founders as well, like just learning what motivates people and how they're going to absorb information. That's my challenge, but also my greatest, kind of thrill as a professor is like figuring out how to reach people who don't really understand or don't embrace the material initially. That's what we do, right? So anyway, that may be more of interest to me than anybody else, but I think it's a fun and important part of being in the ecosystem is trying to figure out what's the way I can kind of frame this message that will resonate with the audience. And incidentally, that is what we've tried to work into the book, right? Is not to write an academic text about thou shalt or thou shalt not, but something that is hopefully a little bit more consumable, and gives anecdotes and examples that the reader can kind of relate to and learn from without being hit over the head.
This episode is brought to you by Full Stack PEO. Most founders start companies because they figured out a better way to solve a problem or serve a need, not because they love tracking payroll, filling out compliance forms, and explaining employee benefits packages. And yet, all that stuff still has to be done. That's why there's Full Stack PEO. Full Stack PEO specializes in turnkey HR for emerging companies, not just those core services, but advice and expertise that help founders maximize employee potential. Curious? Find out more at fullstackpeo.com.
So we've already kind of swerved over into the human side just with the last couple of topics, which is fantastic. Let's do the same thing over there. So in the human ocean, maybe start with a quick overview of that, and then I'd love maybe one or two nuggets that pop from your experience, the ones that you encounter the most in the wild.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So first of all, the way we structure the book and extending the metaphor, we have these oceans that you've already talked about. And then within each of the oceans, we have a number of C's. So in the human ocean, we have the co-founder C, right? Who are your co-founders and how do you treat them, et cetera. We have the investors and advisors C, and then we have the employee C. And I hope none of you are like oceanographers or anything out there who would go, how can you possibly have a C inside an ocean? That doesn't make sense. Just let that go, if you don't mind. So we have these C's in the human C. Again, we have the founder C, investor advisor, and the employee C. And within each of those, we have some icebergs that you might encounter, or sets of icebergs. And one of the first with the founders is how you actually allocate equity. And it's not at all unusual for three founders to go out for beers and sit around and sketch something out on the back of the napkin and woohoo, we're the next Facebook and let's split it, 33 1/3% each or whatever. Well, that you've just created a huge iceberg right there. You don't even know what the implications are downstream for what investors are going to do and how that's going to influence behavior. So especially with three, I think Michael calls it the curse of third-sies.
Third-sies, yep. Third-sies is evil.
Yeah, third-sies is evil.
Yep.
And we talk about that again in the book. But, when you have three people that are at the very beginning of a journey, it's very unusual for all three of them to stay equally engaged through that entire journey. So what often happens is one person, not because they're bad people or because they intend to be a free rider, but they life changes, they get a new job, their spouse, gets out of work and they have to work harder or whatever it is. But life kind of gets in the way and they kind of gradually disengage a little bit, but they still own a third of the company, right? And you're not getting equal output. So again, one of the big icebergs and then one of the big, how do you address this? At a minimum, you want to make sure you vest over time. You can use reverse vesting or there are a number of mechanisms to do that, but allocate equity as it's actually earned. And I advocate what I call extreme vesting or something that goes well beyond what I see recommended to many, many startups, which is if you're 5 to 10% of the way through the journey that's going to be long and difficult, don't allocate more than 5 to 10% of the equity. So if you're two co-founders and you have an idea and you're starting to move it forward, maybe each of you get 5%, but then you set up what does it take to actually now earn the next piece of equity? You've got plenty of left on the table now. At a minimum, what most would recommend is you have a set-aside option pool, right? So you have 20% that you set aside so that when you bring somebody new onto the management team, which is likely going to happen in your first years, you don't have to kind of dig into your own pocket and take money out of your wallet. You have a pool already set aside. It's not coming from anybody's stake. It's already been factored into the cap table. And that's an easy way. So those are two things. Vest equity over time, don't split evenly, and have at least a set-aside pool, if not extreme vesting.
Give me another one that you see in the wild on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah, so I could cite some local ventures that kind of fall into one of these two models.
Dude, I'm right here. I'm sitting right here.
One is the whale, right? Or the really big fish, or the bunch of minnows. So entrepreneurs tend to love to either go get the guy who was the first salesperson for XXX, insert your favorite big success story here.
Got it.
Yeah, it's going to cost us $200,000 a year plus options, an equity stake. And yeah, they're an arrogant, beep. I just beeped myself.
Thank you.
Mike didn't even have to do that. But yeah, look at the success they had. Well, first of all, success in one other venture is pretty unlikely to actually translate to the next venture, right? So you want people that have a track record of success over a number of firms, and ideally 1 or 2 failures as you start to bring them in. So they hopefully have learned some lessons, maybe humbled them a little bit. But also, you're overpaying for an asset that you just don't know is going to work. Now, the flip side of that are the people who say, man, I love these interns, and we have a number of programs that take these undergrads, and they're bright, and they're well trained, and
just give
whatever
raw
that
talent.
may be. Yeah.
That's right.
And they're cheap. This is awesome. They're so inspiring. Yeah, but they don't know anything. So you have to spend a lot of time training, getting them up to speed, and 1 in 10 may actually be a good fit for your company, but it also might take you a couple of years to kind of groom them and for them to get traction. So hiring 10 people at $30,000 or 1 person at $300,000 is probably not either extreme that you want to be on, right? You want to have some kind of tiered labor pool. So in the employee C, that's an iceberg that I see a lot of startups make. And it's tricky. There's no easy solution for this. I'm not trying to pretend I have the answers to everything. But again, systematically, I have seen those 2 ends of the spectrum, and I think both are equally dangerous.
When you guys were planning the book, how did you intend for it to be read? Is the idea that this is something that I, as a founder, am just reading through cover to cover and try to take as much out of it as I can at that time? Or is it more like, a reference book that as I hit these heuristics, right? Because an iceberg is a heuristic, right? As I hit these hidden debts, like, oh, that feels like something I read. And, back when I read that book, The Titanic Effect, then I'm going to go back and read that or just dive into that one chapter because that's where I feel pain right now, maybe. Mm-hmm. When you guys were envisioning your reader, who was that persona? How are they going to read it?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's one we talked a lot about in terms of the book kind of design and feel. And initially, of course, like any entrepreneur, we're like, everybody's going to love this book, right?
Sure, right?
But you can't write it for everybody. You've got to write it for, 1 or a few kind of populations. So if you look at kind of the inner circle of who we're targeting, who do we really hope this book can be a benefit to? It's the early stage entrepreneur, either pre-revenue in planning or early stage revenue and growth. So if you're already at the point where you have a board of directors and you're scaling and you're raising, your A or B round with venture capital, I think it still hopefully would be entertaining, and you might look back and go, wow, did we make a lot of mistakes? And it's, in fact, as we talk about these concepts, it's not unusual to have an entrepreneur say, where were you 2 or 3 years ago?
Right.
Well, now we're here, right? So, in reflection, and when you start your next venture, hopefully there's some benefit there. But really the core founder or founding team can really benefit in the early ideation and early launch stages in terms of just our very narrow core. Now, that said, there are folks like yourselves who are not only entrepreneurs, but also investors and also touch a lot of other entrepreneurs. And we think there's benefit for those kind of members of the ecosystem who support entrepreneurs, but also investors so mostly, again, early stage angel investors, et cetera, that you start to see these patterns across your portfolio of either opportunities to invest in or companies you've already invested in, and you're actually in a position of influence. So if you kind of understand these concepts and can pass them on, we think that can be of great benefit. Now, we also shared the book with and hope that people who like to listen to how I built this, even if they might never be an entrepreneur, or people who think history is cool and business is cool, and the intersection of those two is kind of cool. And by the way, I might learn something about the entrepreneurial ecosystem. We hope that those folks kind of enjoy the book. And if nothing else, when your cousin comes up and says, hey, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, you can kind of have a conversation and actually be, somewhat knowledgeable about the icebergs that they might encounter and ask some good questions. When we shared kind of some initial versions of the book with entrepreneurs and that third category, non-entrepreneurs, but interested business readers, the non-entrepreneurs loved the Titanic stuff and how that was woven in, thought that was really cool. The hardcore entrepreneurs were like, you spend too much time on the Titanic. I want you to get to the good stuff, right? So we had to kind of balance a little bit of, let's weave in some snippets of history in the Titanic, but not have that be, 3 or 4 pages. and then get to kind of some more recommendations that also led us to include some tools within the book that are kind of navigation clues. So we have these icons that we've embedded. So from a design standpoint, entrepreneurs can recognize, oh, okay, these are some icebergs I should be aware of. So if you're looking for those icebergs, you can quickly kind of familiarize yourself and then go back and find them later when you start to hit those icebergs. For investors and supporters, we have this kind of lookout that is like a red flag, right? If you see entrepreneurs doing this, you probably should be wary or at least warn them about it. So one of my favorites is if you have an entrepreneur that's out raising institutional dollars, right? They're going outside friends and family for the first time, and they're still referring to the venture as I. They have not internalized the team concept. It's about them. And in my opinion, I'm not going to invest in somebody, and I would encourage you to invest when an entrepreneur is still referring to the company as I, because at that point, they typically have co-founders or at least other members of the founding team or management team. They have employees. And to me, that's just a signal of how they view the venture that needs to evolve. So what you asked about was how does someone actually read this and learn from it? Like, what's the best way to navigate the book? So first, I would start with just reading the introductory chapter, because that's going to give you a feel and flavor for the overall structure, but also like whether you want to keep reading. So I think at Amazon, you can go in, you can scan the first chapter, and this is not going to be for everybody, our whole style and approach. And I think you can kind of get that in the first chapter. Now, what bothers me about a lot of business books is you read the first chapter and it's like, wow, this is kind of cool. It's a good concept. And then the other 250 pages are like more iteration of that same exact concept and all the reasons that the author was super smart in how they internalized and developed the consulting business around, using that tool to kind of sell to everybody. So we worked pretty hard at least trying to add value throughout the book, as opposed to just one core concept in the intro or the first chapter. However, we also hope, and with some of the work that particularly Michael is focusing on with an iceberg index. So what we've done is to take these oceans of hidden debt and these different icebergs and actually developed an index, which is like a self-evaluation tool of where have I encountered these hidden debts, and therefore what might I do about it? I'm probably remiss in not stating this earlier, but it's not that entrepreneurs shouldn't take on hidden debts, right? They have to make choices under uncertainty, and there's going to be some unintended consequences of that. But those debts shouldn't be completely hidden. You should have an understanding that they're below the surface, but we understand that they're there and we're going to have to deal with them at some point and budget for that, whatever that means. It may not be dollars, it may be time, it may be people, it may be getting advice, whatever. So it's all about kind of identifying those and being able to navigate around them, as opposed to saying, through reading this book, you will be in an iceberg-free ocean, because that's just not going to happen for a startup. However, to navigate these tools or this uncertainty, what we have done is to kind of translate it into this index and then a literal map of icebergs. So what we hope is that startups will download one of these maps and put it up on their wall, and employees, they can do it anonymously, or it can be part of the weekly stand-up where you go and put a sticker or a thumb pin in and say, there's a hidden debt here that's growing with our value proposition for customers. And that opens the door for a conversation, right? Instead of kind of putting your hand up and say, hey, we suck at, if there's a red thumbtack in and the founder or whoever's leading it kind of says, okay, looks like we might have a problem in this area. Can anyone add some insight about that? It's likely that multiple people within the startup actually recognize the issue. So it kind of raises those things that might be hidden and below the surface to a level where at least there's some insight into it, hopefully some discussion around it, and then hopefully that leads to, okay, so how do we fix this? What are our steps moving forward? So we hope it's more than just a book. We do hope it translates into some ideas and tools that actually help startups be more successful.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so I think that's probably a good amount of time. Thank you so much for making this much time available. If people want to learn more about the book, want to find it, I'm assuming there's a website for the book and social medias and whatnot. Where can people learn more?
Yes, I would encourage you to go to www.titaniceffect.com. And we not only have, obviously, links to the book and some endorsements there. Had some very kind folks write some nice endorsements about their perspectives on the concepts. We also have had a blog going now for, since October. So we've got a number of posts that are kind of snippets of the concepts out of the book that might give you some information and insight today, but also a sense of whether the content is something that's a good fit for you and your organization.
Awesome. And then I know you guys are on Twitter because I follow you out there.
Yes, we are.
And then I'm assuming you're on some other platforms as well?
Yeah. Well, we personally are on LinkedIn also. Always feel free. And then Facebook, I believe you can follow us on Facebook as well. But you know who should ask that question to?
Okay.
Is our marketing expert, Kim Saxton.
All right. And we'll be talking with Kim next week. So we'll dive into marketing there. Todd, thank you so much, man.
Thanks, Mike.
It's a great book, and I'm super grateful you decided to do the extended 3-part series with us.
Yes. Well, thanks so much and appreciate it again.
If you're thinking of launching a SaaS product, Startup Competitors can provide data on your closest competitors, survey potential users, or provide other product validation services. Learn more at startupcompetitors.com.